On today's episode of Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma, I was finally experiencing all those things, and it was like a revelation.
Connecting with this rich gender diversity within the church's history.
And also, importantly, I'm also finally okay being perfectly imperfect just as I am. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
The show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction,
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagining them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go!
Welcome to the first episode of Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma. I'm Max, and my co-host is my good friend Emma Slick.
Hello!
She is a 25-year-old queer femme disabled Catholic. She's a religious researcher focused on the intersections of queerness, religion, and material culture, and is a museum worker at a large research institution. She lives in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area with her cat Nell, who is the purest creature known on this planet.
Aw. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this podcast. Max Kuzma is a 33-year-old transgender man who is also a lifelong Catholic. He is a writer and an advocate for LGBTQ+ people who has been interviewed by press like the New York Times and the BBC. He lives on a farm in rural central Ohio with his loving partner and lots of furry friends who I can attest are equally, if not more, adorable.
Aw.
So before we get started, let's introduce a little bit more about the podcast and how it came to be. So this podcast was very much about Max and I connecting about what it means to be a queer Catholic person, growing up within really fundamentalist spaces and getting whiplash from seeing the lack of unconditional love when that's what we were sacrificing our lives, our identities, our entire selves for. With that being said, we're really focused on also from this point of sacrificing who we are, getting whiplash to then transition to unconditional love that we are learning for ourselves and for members of the queer Catholic community. And also trying to navigate what it looks like finding space for ourselves inside and outside of the church. That will be the crux of what this podcast is.
That's absolutely true. And that rolls really well into talking about the masculinity series that we're doing on Substack right now. And that's maxwellkuzma.substack.com. It's a series where we are able to kind of go more in depth and talk about some of the contradictions and complexities that we see, some of the unholy alliances between politics and Catholicism and how that plays out and how it can impact young men today who are looking for good examples. So if you want to check that out, please do so on our Substack. And we will have a future episode of this podcast where we get into some of that in a little more depth.
I love that so much. And so today we're really going to frame the beginning of this podcast series by focusing on our own experiences, just as we did with this masculinity series, foregrounding what brings us to dissect what this whiplash experience looks like, particularly our own deconstruction. So we're going to go back and forth and share a little bit more about our own lives precisely at these points before, during, and after deconstruction. So Max will get us started with the before section of his life, before this point of deconstruction, and then we'll pass it back and forth to share more about the commonalities, but also the differences in what we experienced growing up.
Exactly. And I have to say that when I sat down to think about before deconstruction, I was like, oh my goodness, that was like the dumpster fire time. That was just that was just
100%.
the time when I just did not know what I was doing. I didn't know how I was feeling, what I was gonna where I was gonna end up. So I think that moment in time can really be most accurately defined by the time when I was basically ready to embrace my trans identity. So at the moment when I started to back away from the Catholic professional space, because that's like, I had only Catholic jobs. I went to a Catholic university. I only knew Catholic people. And so when I left my Catholic job and just got a secular job, which is just a funny characterization in and of itself, but when I did that, it suddenly presented me the space where I didn't feel like I had to perform as much, because the thing is that I knew that pursuing my trans identity would mean that that performance of my life, like this performance of this Catholic person, was all gonna fall away, was all gonna come crumble. I also knew it would mean starting from scratch. Um, and one aspect I think about too is, it's like, well, if anyone changes their mind, or if anybody, embraces the LGBTQ identity lifestyle, they must have not been a true Catholic before. But I really do believe I was very sincere in my pursuit and belief, of this very rigid and strict fundamentalist conservative type of Catholicism. I really wanted to make it work. I really believed that, I believed in the promises of it, that, I would be sacrificing things that were important to me, but that would mean happiness. And when that didn't happen, that's part of what kicked off the deconstruction process. I also wanted to note too that, like, because of the level of scrutiny and intensity about my identity, I know a lot of queer people go through this who are raised Catholic as well, or even just Christian. And so we often tend to know the rules more than the average believer. We know more about it. We have really looked into all the okay, what's the footnote to this Vatican document? Going back to that old papyrus website that they have for the Vatican,
Classic.
and reading and all there. Um, so at that time, I knew all about the new evangelization. I knew all about what, like, John Paul II said about theology of the body. I knew about these ideas of, like, this is how Catholicism is supposed to be. And I know that I was also impacted by Pope Benedict, and his quote, "You were not made for comfort, you were made for greatness." I really was impacted by that, and it was something that, was part of this wrestling, because the truth is that I wanted to embrace this idea of greatness. I wanted to be part of this vision, of this kind of Benedict option that came after the new evangelization, which is kind of a strategy that draws on the authority of Scripture and the wisdom of the ancient church, with the goal to embrace exile from mainstream culture and construct a resilient counterculture, which I highlight because I do also think that we are definitely seeing this counterculture concept. Like, we have our own culture of conservative Catholicism. And, I was committed to building that up in the time before my transition in deconstruction, through, and that's kind of what I was saying, through having my whole world, my whole social life, my whole professional life, everything that I was doing was kind of unified under this category. I also thought of the comparison of, like, the royal family of England, and how they have to kind of act and perform the role of royal, how it requires a lot of studying, etiquette, manners, and all of these things. And how, when Prince Harry chose to walk away publicly, they also had to distance themselves from him, which is something that you can see a lot of the times. It's something that happened to me with a lot of friends, even with my family, my parents, because, for someone to walk away, it kind of like casts questions and doubts upon that thing, whatever it is, whether it's the royal family or whether it's Catholicism, which, when it comes to Catholicism, I don't think it has to. And I think that's part of my motivation in sharing and talking in this podcast is, you can be a queer Catholic. You can have both. It doesn't have to be this rigid binary opposites. Yeah, so that's basically a picture of where I was, and kind of like what was all brewing inside of me, prior to embracing my trans identity and subsequently going through the deconstruction process. I do also want to say it was very much like I kind of just closed my eyes and jumped, trusting that God would catch me, because I really believed in God, and I believed in the unique, the that God made me for a purpose, that my uniqueness really mattered. But I will say I was ultimately shocked in just how much he really did catch me. But that's a little spoiler. So I will turn it over to Emma to do her before now.
I love teasing. I love teasing a little bit of what we're going to hear in a little bit. And I think that's such a wonderful transition because this idea of thinking that it was an either or decision of you can either be a queer person or you can be a person of faith, but you can't have both was really critical to me in this before deconstruction phase. So, as a little background for myself, similar to Max, I grew up in this pretty conservative Catholic parish in the Chicagoland area. And my before deconstruction was having been raised in this really conservative space, raised in these purity culture programming. I had performed this level of hyperfemininity and this form of heterosexuality in order to protect myself. And it was not only putting on a performance for others, it was putting on a performance for myself. Um, so, a critical piece of this was I was in college. I was about 4 hours away from my family at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. So, kind of right in the heart of this Rust Belt area. And I was leading somewhat of a double life. When I entered college, I was still in this space of performance where I was one of the central cantors for the church choir at this really fundamentalist Catholic church that was located just a stone's throw. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just like so many queer people are like in the choir all the time. Like we've
Exactly.
we've always been here in your churches. You should love
Exactly.
us too.
Well, and I think what you talk about is so important. And what connected me to this history was a lot of, and I'll delve into this a little bit in my deconstruction phase, was really connecting with this rich gender diversity within the church's history and fully understanding that I wasn't myself an isolated incident or in conflict with the church and itself and how it has practiced and performed gender throughout history. So for me, I was in the choir. I was part of some elements of youth ministry at my church. I was really deeply involved in the church. I was constantly in it, but at the same time, I was doing a lot of historical research. I got my degree in history and biology, but that's a story for another time. Um, so I got my degree in history, and as part of that, really fell in love with exploring and kind of examining what it means to study religious history, but also histories of religious resistance and resiliency. So, when I was at Ball State University and I first entered, my first project focused on religion actually centered on Jewish identity and anti Semitism at Ball State University and in Muncie. Especially as a community that has itself witnessed a great deal of anti Semitism as this model community. Muncie was Middletown from these prototypical American society studies. And one of the great criticisms of this Middletown, which has been used to study Muncie and study its African American population, study its LGBTQ plus ones, its Jewish ones, um, was how so many people are left out of this narrative of what it means to be a prototypical American, and as I would learn, what it means to be a prototypical person of faith. So for me, I got involved in LGBTQ plus history in the Muncie area, conducting oral history interviews, again, working with the Jewish community in Muncie, but really diving deep into what it means to be a queer person raised in evangelical Protestant spaces.
I also love, Emma, that your impulse as this, young queer historian, you were like, "Ooh, I will investigate these
Yes.
aspects of identity that are important to me." I just love that impulse that you had and how that set you on this path.
I appreciate it. And that was very much what it was. Is I entered college and I was like, I think I love museums. Again, this is as somebody who is autistic and was learning to understand that identity. And I was like, I love working in the bowels of the museum, kind of very much in these museum collections. But I love these histories. And so it was kind of falling in love with the process of doing my own investigative work. Um, and so
I
I
love it so much.
yes, yes. And so for me, that was it, was like loving and finding out that I had this passion for religious history and what it looks like. But then at the same time, being challenged both by professors in a positive, gentle way, but also by myself and by this fundamentalist Catholic Church to think critically about, well, who are you within this space? So much of your life, just as you said, Max, has been kind of this unconditional acceptance of what this fundamentalist Catholicism is. And I think what you hit on is so wonderful, Max, this idea of this holy sacrifice of yourself and your whole person for the purpose of sanctification. I do want to also add here that I actually conducted an interview with Danielle Wild, who's a wonderful artist several weeks ago who had presented her sonnet cycle called St. Joan of Bradford that explores kind of Catholicism, queer Catholic identity among schoolgirls in this space. And she articulates this really well, this idea of kind of trying to sacrifice yourself and for that to be a sanctifying experience. And I think there are places for that, especially as Max talks about in this big push today of counterculture and kind of validating and glorifying what it means to be different and separate from a secular world. But then it's really harmful for queer people like myself who were trying to find her place in this world. So as at this time that I was conducting oral history interviews with the Muncie LGBTQ plus Catholic Project, I was also conducting a research project about what traditionalist Catholic women in veiling looked like. I was leading this double life before this deconstruction. And I know we've talked about this, Max, of I was singing in the choir, just like so many queer Catholic people. But at the same time, I had a copy of She Who Is in my backpack, just sitting there because I was involved in
Contraband.
yes, yeah, because I was involved in this LGBTQ plus Christian reading group that a professor had established. And so it was looking at queer liberation theology through this feminist angle. And so at the same time, I was trying to figure out what my piece of life was. And just as Max said, a lot of what it looked like for me during this deconstruction process and immediately before was trusting that even if I wasn't meant to find a place in the church, I needed to go through a process to understand where I was and why I was believing what I was. And I think that focus on religious history was all focused on this idea of conviction, but also understanding what I was committing myself to. So it was trusting that even if I didn't fall within the church, even if this idea of you cannot have both, be a queer Catholic, be a queer person of faith, that my choice would be dictated by what I found out through the process of investigating my own and queer existences within the church.
Yeah, like you trusted the investigative process because I always think of it as like, if it is true that God loves us and created us and gave us, gave us our identity and gave us the ability to know Him through knowing ourselves, then if we seek that self knowledge, that we will find Him because He made us as we are. That's always how I think of it. Um, and I also wanted to say that this idea of having like the contraband, little book, it
Yeah.
kind of made me think also of that common thought in the queer community, or even actually just in general, people who have deconstructed, period, where it's like, so you taught us all about a guy who like gave food away to people, provided healthcare, hung out with people who were different or foreigners, like people from strange lands, and you're surprised that we are now like socialists.
Also, what you talk about is, and again, like plugging that I was raised in this purity culture. I don't want to delve too much into it, but there's a wonderful interview that Max and I got into about our own like childhood experiences that's shared on this Substack in the masculinity series. But this idea that Jesus very much was associated with people who were working in different fabrics of society, were associated with women, including women who were married, women who weren't married, women in different strata and classes of society, and was also deconstructing the idea that, very much in my interpretation of it, that sexist and patriarchal constructions of power in his own communities, again, the first among you cast the stone at this woman who was about to be killed, that he was trying to unpack what that looked like within his own time. And again, that currently today we're seeing the same theology, the same stories of Christ being weaponized against minority communities, against LGBTQ plus people like ourselves, against women.
That's absolutely well said. I will use that point to transition into my
I love it.
during deconstruction phase. Say deconstruction like 12 times fast in a row, and you'll just run out. You'll just not be able to anymore. um, So, like, for me, the actual launching point of deconstruction, I'm thinking of this moment in time as also the moment when I knew what deconstruction was. Because I would say during that first part, I really didn't actually even know much about what deconstruction was. Like, I hadn't heard the term, and I hadn't seen examples of it before. I just knew I was wrestling with my identity, and as part of that, the wrestling with the faith was implied, partially because of everybody around me freaking out, like, how can you be trans, like, this isn't a real thing, and all this stuff. um so at the beginning, I was pretty confused, and then I started to do some research, and I didn't really find any Catholic specific guides. It may be different now, and it may be that there were some at the time that I just didn't know how to access or find. um and I was in some private Facebook groups where I would be like, well, what about this aspect? Or what are you guys thinking about this? But it felt like everybody in those groups were at different stages, and that we didn't necessarily all have the same language, which makes it difficult to communicate productively, which is another reason why Emma and I are like passionate about just having these conversations, doing the writing, doing the podcast as well, is like we want to help that conversation by bringing in some of this shared language, so that you know other queer people who are at various stages, various points. That's a very important thing to highlight as well. Is this podcast isn't just for somebody who deconstructed and then reconstructed and they're still Catholic. This isn't just for somebody who left Catholicism. This is for all these different types of perspectives. um so yeah, that was some of
100%.
the challenges. Yeah, so that was some of the challenges in the confusion. And additionally, that's why I now think that, like, having a philosophy or some starting point for what deconstruction is so important. So really, it's just an understanding of where you're coming from and what the groundwork is in order to determine what your goals are, which sounds like, your annual performance review, and you have to come up with smart goals at work to try to, like, what am I going to do for the year? But it is kind of true that you have to do some of this if you're really wanting to, like, dig deep and understand, which, again, that's another thing. Not everybody wants to do that. Some people just want to step away. Maybe they step away for a few months. Maybe they step away for a few years. Maybe they don't ever come back to the type of Catholicism they were raised in, and they don't really dig into it. Maybe they just find a new, maybe like, a Presbyterian tradition that speaks to them, or some other tradition where they are able to find happiness. I'm getting way off on all these other people's stories instead
No,
of my
no, and
own.
100%. And I think what you're speaking at is so incredibly important here is that those experiences are valid. In that very much this is about queer people reconciling with what it means to continue the faith and reconstruct it, but also the validity of queer people that have chosen to step away from the church and are deconstructing what that means
Exactly.
to them and the power systems that they continue to occupy.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Emma. I appreciate you. You are always have such a good way of summarizing.
I appreciate
And
you too. 100, and I think that's so incredibly important. And one thing I also wanted to add, that what you're about to go into, what deconstruction is very much at the heart of this series of bringing these deeper dives into liberation theology and academic speak and terminology to a general public. Because I think there's often a gatekeeping of knowledge that disconnects the people who can very much benefit from these philosophies from the people who are creating them.
100%. And so, on that theme of, like, let's define and kind of see where we're starting from, what I actually ended up realizing, because I was in the thick of it at that point, is that I didn't actually have my own moral framework to work from. They always talk about that Christianity is like the moral framework, but the truth is that it was really just a list of rules that I would follow. Like, I didn't actually have a complex or nuanced morality that I could use in different situations. I really just had, well, it's black and white. There may have been detailed analyses of those fixed binary points, but that's not the same thing as having, like, a nuanced actual morality in and of itself, because if you're just spending all this time in sort of this academic scholarly pursuit, which Catholicism is like trademark,
Yeah.
all the back and forth, the encyclicals, all the different priests and saints and all the different people who have, done all these deep dives, and yet we're still coming to the same point. So it's not the same thing as actually understanding a complex, dynamic, responsive, like put me in the situation and ask me to make a moral decision. I'm going to be like, okay, what did the church say? I got to go Google it real quick before I can decide. And so that was difficult. And uh, if you've heard of in the system, a lot of people have heard of flight or fight or flight, but not many have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. There's actually another option there, mostly because if you freeze, you're going to be eaten by the dinosaur or whatever. So I think it's not it's not talked about so much because of
The
that.
lesser choice.
The lesser choice. But in this case, it really was like being frozen. In the sense, in the moral decision making sense, it was like I'm frozen. I can't decide. I can't make a move. I can't do anything. Like with my queer identity, was also frozen. I just couldn't make my own decisions is how I felt. And of course, another topic that we could talk about is conversion therapy at this point, because that's something that many queer people go through, not just people of faith, but often people of faith. And it is something that we will touch on later in this podcast, and I'm sure touch on later in our written series as well. But I didn't go through conversion therapy, thank goodness. But I was still in this process of moving beyond just all I can do is say something is strictly good or strictly bad to, okay, what are these shades of gray? I spent so many I spent so long having like little mini breakdowns talking to my friends like, but this is like how can I decide what to do about this, because it's like there's this aspect and this aspect. How do you decide what is important? How do you decide how to make like any decisions? And what I ultimately realized is, and ultimately began to work towards, is a framework that actually does align with Catholic social teaching, precisely because it is oriented toward the good. And so it has that in common with Catholicism, with Catholic social teaching, with the pursuit of the truth and the good. But it was a confusing time during deconstruction because I felt like I wasn't making progress because I couldn't even understand what I was doing. And that's again why I like to emphasize making a plan of understanding and goals and understanding what you're even trying to accomplish, because otherwise it's going to be so frustrating of like, what even am I doing? Where am I even going? So that's kind of like, for me, that was like mainly the work of the middle part, identifying what I'm doing and then starting on that long path of, okay, so I need to create something dynamic and responsive for my moral system.
100%. And you say that so eloquently and I think it's also important to emphasize here that I think both for you and I, the during process is a messy one. It's not going to be a linear process, just as recovery from any injury is not going to be a linear process in that road. So
Exactly.
for the same way for me during my deconstruction process, I was living this double life, just as I mentioned a little bit earlier. And I was increasingly coming not necessarily to unpack, but to kind of critique and question the system of complete obedience to the church that I was raised within. I think my parents had placed some seeds of questioning and some points where I could make my own decisions about what the process looked like, but also could come up with some ethical decision making on my own, but those were outside of the church. And those were points of contact when I had come into conflict with the church. So moments when I had to take birth control for PCOS, and that was kept kind of quiet from the church because no one would understand what other implications they would be. Those were moments where my dad wrote to the pastor after I went through a purity culture program, which we talked more about in our previous conversation, because there wasn't an equivalent for the young boys in the church. It was necessarily falling on the shoulders of the young women. Um, but yes, 100% at this point, I had a couple moments where I had been prompted to think critically for myself, but this deconstruction moment was giving myself the liberty to critique a system that I thought was not only essential to who I was as a person, but critical to how I experienced community and family. So, especially coming from like a deeply Polish and Irish Catholic family, a lot of every single family moment of family gathering, grieving, connection point was through the lens of the church. I have family members who are in the church hierarchy, who are ordained members of the church itself. So for me, my moment was sitting in an interview with Ray Replogle, then the only queer affirming videographer in Indiana, and hearing them say that purity culture was a thing that they had lived through and survived, and that they then had taken space for themselves to distance who they were from the church and had given themselves the liberty to take a step back and to think critically about systems that they thought were just inherent to how they could exist and what they were part of. Again, their family was deeply involved in this kind of campus ministry that still exists as part of Ball State University. So for me, it was giving myself license to understand what was going on, and also to think critically and challenge the system that seemed so old and regimented to myself, but also leaning into my love of historical research. So one of my favorite moments was thinking that, and I say this of growing up in the early 2000s, this idea of we were in the social purity movement. So much of evangelical gender norms were being absorbed by and the programming was being copied into a Catholic framework of understanding.
The unholy alliance.
Yes, yes. um, but what I was really understanding was this wasn't indicative of the entire church history. And that's what we talk about in the Substack series,
Yes.
was this idea that my deconstruction was diving into the literature in some way. And I think that's my autistic brain just thinking through, like, show me the source material. So
100%.
yeah, it was not only connecting with books like She Who Is that are modern examples, and I say modern as someone who delves in history, and I'm like, yes, the 1970s and 1980s, so modern. Um, but thinking through the idea of in back into medieval periods of history, as I was trying to find a space that I could exist here as a queer person, as a queer femme person, coming in contact with not only saints, but also hagiographies of saints that explored their life where gender queer identities, but also same sex relationships were valued and seen as divine methods of love. Um,
Hmm.
so, very much for me, deconstruction was going back to the primary source material and knowing that I
Yeah,
could exist.
and that reminds me a lot too of many transgender people, especially like before now, with the advancement of the internet, and technology. The global connection has brought more awareness to trans and queer identities largely, but for a lot of trans people, like I'm friends with like trans women who are in their 50s, for example, and they tell me it was like there was nothing, there was no real way of knowing or understanding. I have one friend who would look in the dictionary. Literally, all she had was the dictionary, and the dictionary had the word transsexual at the time, and she would just go in there and read that definition and be like, "Is that me?" And then, of course, we had many years of negative portrayals in film and television to deal with too. But I just bring that up to say, you know, after transitioning and beginning to learn about these histories myself, I was blown away by seeing the beautiful and rich history. I mean, even in the Bible, we have eunuchs. We
Yeah,
have we have people who do not fit into these rigid traditionalist roles. And throughout history, we have examples, and there were cultures. This really did blow my mind when I learned this. There were cultures that actually uplifted and gave places for transgender people. Not that we were outcasts and weirdos, but that we actually had important roles, like to be devotees at goddess temples, for example. Like, that's an important social role in any society. And so I think what you say about connecting with the history and actually seeing beyond the narrative that is like being told to us about who and how queer people fit in, and the idea of complementarianism, gender complementarianism, as if this is this thing that was signed and sealed from Adam and Eve. And it's like, well, actually, there are so many, you know, deeply diverse stories, characters, relationships to saints and all these different histories. And that is something that's really strengthening. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hijack your part too
Not at
much, but
all.
I wanted to
Not at
add that.
all. And I think one thing critical here to like also dive into the Substack was, for me, I had written a piece about 2 years ago or 1 year ago, for Pride for US Catholic, about how gender diversity was part of the church. And again, this was after this deconstruction process, but just the mighty pushback online that I delved to in one of these Substack
That is an
essays.
understatement.
Yeah, just like,
Elon Musk replied, that's a bit, that's next level.
but just like the just, and not only that, it was that people were upset with the idea that gender diversity existed in the church, but just how it challenged their own construction of what gender looked like within these systems. Um, because I think it all connects to this idea that both for Max and I, there was this essentializing of Catholicism in every aspect of our life that I touched on in my family. But people's reaction highlighted how just deeply uncomfortable the idea that if we were going to challenge, for me, one aspect of Catholicism, challenging my construction of gender and purity culture from this interview with Ray Replogle, it would mean challenging every other system of power that I believed in and played a part in. In the same way that you talk about the idea of you weren't involved in conversion therapy, I had a wonderful conversation recently with Dr. Lucas Wilson, who recently published a book called Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. And Wilson really emphasizes this idea that conversion is any experience of someone who is told to regulate or perform their gender in a way that affirms heteronormative, cisgendered ideas. So, the same way that purity culture is a form of conversion therapy, that what you have experienced is a variant of conversion therapy, that many Catholic circles do emphasize this, um, is hitting at the heart that it would mean for me. And what my struggle was in deconstruction is that when I went to dive into the primary sources and saw that I could exist, saw that there were rich histories for myself, from Joan of Arc to Hildegard of Bingen to other saints that had close partners, were kind of subverting gender expectations and were seen as holy because of the ways that they subverted what gender was within the church, and therefore made them closer to God, who rose above these gender constructs that were inherently human. Um, it it made me uncomfortable, and it made things messy of trying to figure out, if I was going to challenge one part of my life, I was going to need to like rehaul the whole bit of it. And that's a lot to deal with and is scary.
Absolutely. It made it, the image I have is like of the dominoes. Like as soon as
Yes.
you
Yeah.
they're all gonna, and I do think that's a reason why there are a lot of queer people who stay closeted or who don't ever end up exploring their identity, who have been raised in Christian or in Catholic spaces, or even like my friend that I mentioned before, who's a trans woman. She transitioned in her 50s, and so it took her a really long time. She had to get to this point of, I feel that I basically can't go on as a person if I'm not able to transition and be true to myself and all that stuff. So I think that's another element of the complexity of it all. Yeah, so and then for me, the final stage in this three-part that we're talking about with deconstruction is after. So what happened after deconstruction? And this is my favorite part.
I'm so
Because
excited.
it really was the time when I actually started, for the first time in my life, to experience the spiritual fruits that I had only ever read about as a child. Like all these good things that happen when you are connected to God and you're living in light and truth and love. Like I was finally experiencing all those things, and it was like a revelation, because all of those things had been promised before, and I was trying to live the rules perfectly, but I was really miserable. I was really disconnected from myself. I was unhappy. I was disconnected from other people too. I've talked about that before, but that's really key. Like I wasn't able to actually have genuine relationships with people because the person that they were interacting with was my performance, a performance of me. Um, and so the spiritual gifts kind of just came flooding down. Because I stopped playing that role, that performance, I did lose my connections to a lot of people. But at the same time, again, they never really had gotten to know the real me. It was like a fake version of me. Um, and I do kind of feel like those people would claim now that I have it backwards. They're like, well, this version of you is like a fake version of you. But I would argue that that's because they have not formed like a sufficient self-awareness that leads to true discernment. Because if you're not actually able to be connected to yourself in a true and genuine, authentic way, like how can you be connected to God in a true, authentic, real way? Um, it's kind of like the characters in the Bible who were allegedly, holy people who would just walk right by a sick or suffering person, or who would spend all their time in the temple in these kind of shows of false piety. Um, these problems are biblical, kind of. As you mentioned, Emma, like we're kind of just recycling some of these things that even they were dealing with in the time of Jesus. And it makes me think of another scriptural quote, which is, "There's nothing new under the sun."
There's been a lot of, especially today with what's going on in America, recirculation of the quote, "Don't sit at tables that Jesus would have flipped."
Yes, exactly. 100%. Um, we could also probably do a whole thing in our masculinity series about how these trad bros are trying to like reclaim that and be like, no, Jesus was actually this muscular, like the veins are popping, and he's flipping the tables of the LGBTQ people, don't you know? I can now see clearly why my life wasn't making sense to me before, and I can see why um, I didn't understand what a loving relationship with God was. But I have those things now. My life makes sense, and I have a loving relationship with God, and I'm a full three-dimensional person. I'm not just this flat performance. And I see that God is not rigid because he's the author of diversity. He is the one who was like, yeah, let's have all of these crazy configurations across human beings and across the animal kingdom and across the whole world. And in some ways, I do feel like my life is like a Disney movie in a good way of like, this is like that turning point where you step into the light and the choir is singing and things are just feeling beautiful and real. And it's like finally understanding that the kingdom of heaven is possible. It is real and material. It's something that we participate in now. And so that really just feels like the fulfillment of the theology that I learned as a child. And also importantly, I'm also finally okay being perfectly imperfect just as I am. And that is really what I want to share with people when I talk about this.
100%. It could not have been said better.
Thank
100%.
you. Thank you, Emma.
And that is 100% where I was after deconstruction. And I agree for myself. It was this idea, and I think it's postulated in a lot of modern traditionalist and fundamentalist Catholic circles, that Catholics are very much this zombie sense of ways, that they are just attending mass and going through the rote actions of what it means to be a person of faith. But in the same way that you understand that it's backwards in the people that you met who argue now that this is a different version of who you are, it was the same way for me, of that concept of being someone who was just going through the rote motions was me before deconstructing my faith. It was someone that had a belief that just going through the motions of this, not hearing God's word, not understanding what context I was raised within, not truly believing some of these things, but going along with it because this was the system I was raised in, was enough for me. And it was coming to the precipice, as I talked about during construction, of realizing that if I was going to deconstruct part of my faith, it would mean the whole thing. So for me, after deconstruction, was really reassembling everything from the ground up. So in thinking about gender, and I was like, that's the one thing that I really enjoy dissecting as someone who was raised in purity culture, as someone who does a lot of work around queer religious communities and histories with the Queer and Catholic Oral History Project, a lot of it for me was, if we're going to talk about gender roles and gender obligations within the church, that's going to be the systems of power on which everything is balanced. So it's going to mean that you not only have to understand and reconstruct your relationship with what gender is and the practice of gender diversity within the history of the church, connecting yourself to this rich history and understanding that you have saints, you have like church figures, you have members of the Bible that have gone before you and have been strong, fierce, probably queer women. But at the same time, that it would also mean that in reconstructing my faith, I would have a much deeper and more meaningful relationship in the beliefs that I was holding to myself, especially not only surrounding queerness and gender identity, but surrounding social justice work within the church, surrounding
Absolutely.
connecting with figures like Dorothy Day, connecting with the Catholic worker movement, connecting with all of these now visualized as kind of resistant and reactionary Catholic figures that actually played a great deal in how the church has survived and has held meaning to people throughout the 2 millennia it has existed. So for me, after deconstruction was a beautiful way of actually affirming that now I believe in all of the things that I was practicing. This isn't just a
Exactly.
rote, exactly. This isn't just a rote faith that I'm going through or a belief that I'm holding on to because I was born into it, because my family is structured around this, because my mom was my religious ed teacher with me from like literally first grade through confirmation. She would follow me year after year.
Yeah.
Um, but for me, it was very much that now I have a viable interest, and also I have like a player in the game of what it means of Catholicism. I understand not only the history of the scriptures that are being read, but also how I have a role and have like a place within the church's history, and that I'm not anything new. Very much queerness and women's place in the church, even though there is ongoing discussion during the synod about where women should be. Should women be ordained? What role do women serve in the church? That throughout the history of the church, women have been instrumental into not only the survival of these traditions, but also power systems. Yes.
Those men, they can just debate about it, but women have been showing up and doing the work for all this
Yes.
time.
100%. Women are not only instrumental as I have found, and I'm hopefully part of in deconstructing harmful power dynamics, they're also key members of perpetuating harmful ones.
True.
So for me to be a woman, a queer Catholic woman within the church, it means deconstructing which side I have chosen to be on and which power systems I'm going to continue to uplift. Because my power and my ethos and my money and my influence and my voice, I'm now understanding are powerful things that I can use to emphasize what I believe in and further systems of change that I want to see come into the real world.
And I just feel like, as I said in my conclusion, that dovetails so well with Catholic social teaching. What Catholic social teaching is really about. Like, I never learned about Catholic social teaching really when I was in the before times. Like, it's been a revelation and a beautiful participation. And can I also just say, um, Pope Francis is the goat for dodging death, and he's been such a great example of kind of what does it actually look like to integrate these Catholic social teaching elements into real life. He has been an example of having conversations with members of the LGBTQ community, especially trans people, and making sure that the synodal process, this idea of listening to the people, is ongoing, that it's not just one and done. All right, we don't have to like listen to the people anymore, that he's making it an ongoing process where we can continue to have these conversations as we all work for this kingdom of heaven on earth.
100%. And also how he's a model of healthy masculinity amid
True.
everything that's going on. And that's something that we'll delve into a little bit later
Yes, in our written Substack.
in our written Substack. With that being said, that was very much my deconstruction process. But deconstruction is only going to be the start or jumping off point for our additional conversations. This podcast is going to be an ongoing experience delving into gender and sexuality at the intersection of Catholicism today, from masculinity to femininity to everywhere in between, and what it means to us, but also what it means to you all.
Yeah, and to that point as well, we will have guests, not every time, but definitely at points, who will join us to share their stories too. Because in this idea of developing a shared language, I think when we see stories from other people, we can see the things that are similar and the things that are different, and the different versions of Catholicism, but what they have in common, and that will allow us to continue critiquing the fundamentalist aspects that become overly rigid for queer people, especially, but ultimately for all people. And so the after phase of deconstruction has opened up a whole new world of questions and possibilities. And this podcast is one of the results of an approach to engaging with those ideas. As we've said before, your journey may lead you to entirely different conclusions, but we still hope to be part of the larger discussion around these issues and welcome you to engage with us.
100%. And I think at the crux of what you say is that there's no one destination or one answer to what deconstruction is going to be. This podcast is only the opening to many more conversations and questions that we hope that you all will ask of yourselves and think critically about. So as this goes on, we also invite you, as this podcast is posted on Substack, to respond with your comments, respond with your thoughts, respond with your challenges, things that you are grappling with, and what it means to exist in this space, whether or not you choose to remain in Catholicism, whatever phase you're in, if it's before, during, and after, or if there's something else entirely of where you are right now. We appreciate you being part of this journey with us, and we're really excited for where this podcast is going to go in the future.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And as Emma said, even if you're listening somewhere else like Spotify, or in the future, if we get this on Apple Podcasts, you can always come back to our Substack page if you want to leave a comment on a specific episode, because we have them there and Substack will allow you to do that. And then, we're both nerds, so we'll be right on it and be ready to respond to you because we love talking about this stuff. So please do join us there as well. Thank you so much for listening to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma.
Thank you. And that wraps up today's conversation on deconstruction. We hope this episode gave you some insight into our journeys, and more importantly, sparked some questions and thoughts of your own. The process of deconstruction is ongoing, and while it's been a starting point for us, we know it's just the beginning of a larger conversation.
Exactly. Deconstruction isn't a destination, it's a process that unfolds over time. We will continue exploring gender, sexuality, Catholicism, queerness, all our favorite topics on each episode of this podcast, opening up new questions and perspectives. We hope you can join us as we dive deeper into these topics, challenging traditional ideas and engaging in meaningful dialogue about the real complexities of faith and identity today.
Remember, there's no one right answer to deconstruction, and we're all on our own unique journeys. We'd love to hear from you and continue this conversation, so please feel free to connect with us online, on Substack, on social media, and in other places. Find more resources and a bibliography in the show notes for this episode on Substack.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Catch you in the next episode of Whiplash.